My family condemned me as a coward who abandoned the Navy, but when the general called my name as colonel before the entire auditorium, the truth erupted and shattered 8 years of humiliation in a single moment. My family swore I was a Navy deserter. I remained silent during my brother's decoration ceremony as a Special Forces commando. Then his general looked at me intently and said, "Colonel, are you here?" The crowd froze. My father's jaw dropped to the floor. The air grew thick as General Martinez's words echoed throughout the auditorium. I could feel hundreds of gazes piercing me like daggers, especially those of my father and mother in the front row. Their faces paled as if they had seen a ghost, not just any ghost, but the ghost of betrayal they themselves had created. I am Michael, 34 years old. For the past 8 years, my family has told everyone I abandoned the Navy out of cowardice. My father, Edward, a former lieutenant who never achieved the military glory he longed for, made my supposed desertion his favorite topic during family gatherings. Michael couldn't stand even 3 months of basic training, he would repeat while serving whiskey to his friends. "Thank God we have Alexander. He has what it takes." My mother, Carol, would nod with a mixture of shame and disappointment, as if I had stained the family name forever. The reality was completely different. I was recruited for a special operations unit so classified that I couldn't even reveal its existence to my own family. I signed confidentiality protocols that prohibited me from talking about my rank, missions, or location. While my family believed I was working at a small security company in the capital, I had led operations in more than 15 countries, rising to the rank of colonel in record time. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering was an exercise in restraint. "At least you found something you can handle," my father would say, patting my shoulder condescendingly while praising Alexander's basic achievements in his training. "Your brother will soon be a Special Forces Marine. Do you know what that means?" Of course, I knew. I had trained several of them. Justice seemed unattainable while I maintained my vow of silence, but fate has unexpected ways of manifesting itself. When Alexander invited me to his graduation ceremony, I agreed to attend despite knowing how uncomfortable it would be. My younger brother wasn't to blame for our parents' lies. He truly believed I had abandoned the Navy because that's what they had told him since he was 16. "I know this might be difficult for you," he wrote to me, "but it would mean a lot if you were there." I chose a seat in the back row, away from my family, wearing civilian clothes instead of the uniform that was rightfully mine. What no one in my family knew was that General Martinez, who would preside over the ceremony, had been my direct superior for 3 years in operations that remained classified. I watched as he stepped up to the podium with his characteristic stern bearing, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak about honor, loyalty, and sacrifice, values that had forced me to endure years of family humiliation in silence. I saw Alexander receive his insignia with pride, my parents applauding with tears in their eyes from the front row. I also applauded discreetly, genuinely happy for my brother. That's when it happened. General Martinez paused, scanned the auditorium with his gaze, and his eyes stopped on me. I saw immediate recognition on his face, followed by something that seemed like indignation. Before concluding, he said into the microphone, his voice resonating with authority, "I must recognize someone whose presence here today is as unexpected as it is honorable." A murmur ran through the room. "Colonel Michael, could you please stand up?" For a second, nobody moved. You could only hear the hum of the ventilation system and the timid creaking of chairs adjusting. I felt the world slow down as if I were underwater. My eyes slowly rose and met Martinez's. He didn't blink. The same man who had ordered me on impossible missions in deserts, slums, and jungles now demanded my presence before hundreds of civilians and ranking officers. I swallowed hard. I stood up. The sound of my bench scraping the floor was, for a moment, the loudest noise in the venue. All faces turned in my direction. I recognized Alexander's, with wide eyes and mouth agape as if he had taken an invisible punch. My parents, God. Edward was static, his glassy eyes and face flushed with shame or fury, it was hard to tell. Carol brought her hand to her mouth as if wanting to contain a scream. I walked down the center aisle like a defendant heading to court. Each step echoed like a reminder of everything they had said about me in the last 8 years, the failure, the coward, the family shame. But in that moment, I was none of those things. I was Colonel Michael, officer of the Advanced Intelligence Special Operations Forces, a unit that until recently didn't even appear in public records. Martinez waited for me on stage. When I got close, he extended his hand firmly and looked at me with something between respect and remorse. This man saved lives in at least 15 countries. He led operations that changed the course of conflicts. And yet, he silently endured the shame imposed by a lie, he said, not hiding the emotion in his voice. Today, as a general and as a man, I break protocol out of duty to justice. People murmured. The name Michael seemed to spread like wildfire among the officers present. Many knew who I was, at least in military circles. But for my family, for those I loved most, I was just the son who had given up. Martinez turned to me and hugged me, not as a symbolic gesture, but as someone who refuses to let a battle brother fall. Applause began discreetly and gradually grew. The entire auditorium was on its feet, except my parents. In that moment, I confess, I wanted to turn around and face them, to show them that the world had finally discovered the truth, that the disowned son had returned. But I resisted. That victory wasn't mine. It belonged to the men who had fallen beside me in missions that will never be recorded in history books. It was for them that I remained standing. Alexander was the first family member to stand up. He ran to me, still with the newly delivered insignia pinned to his uniform, and hugged me, a confused, tight, urgent hug. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he whispered. "Because I couldn't," I replied, holding the back of his neck as I used to when he was a child. "And because no one wanted to believe me when it mattered most." When I stepped away, I looked one last time at my parents. Edward looked like a cornered animal. The man who always spoke loudly at family gatherings now couldn't even maintain his own gaze. Carol still had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of joy. Martinez then concluded the ceremony. "On behalf of the Navy, I thank those who serve," he said. "But today, I also publicly apologize to those who served and were unjustly forgotten." I left the stage in silence. Nothing more needed to be said there. The damage and the impact had already been done. As I left the auditorium, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Isabella, my wife, who was watching everything through the private broadcast of the ceremony. A simple message: "Now they know. Come home when you're ready. I'm waiting for you." But I wasn't going home immediately. Something told me the real confrontation was yet to come, and for the first time in years, I was ready to face it. Few words were exchanged after the ceremony. Alexander looked at me with admiration and confusion. Carol seemed about to collapse but avoided eye contact. Edward? Well, he simply left the auditorium before I even came down from the stage, muttering something inaudible while pushing chairs out of his way. Hours later, still in civilian uniform and with the recognition medal discreetly stored in the inner pocket of my jacket, I accepted Alexander's invitation to have dinner with the family. "They want to talk," he said with hope in his eyes that broke my heart. The restaurant was elegant, discreet, with a reserved table away from other customers. I arrived last, as always. The table was silent. Edward sat with his arms crossed, Carol looked at the menu without seeing anything, and Alexander, beside me, was on his phone to break the discomfort. Rose, our oldest aunt, was there too, probably Alexander's attempt to balance the emotions at the table. I sat down. The waiter came to take orders, but no one seemed willing to eat. When he walked away, the Cold War began. 8 years, Michael, Carol began, her voice tense, eyes fixed on the water glass. "You left us for 8 years without a word, and now you appear in an auditorium with a general calling you colonel." I took a deep breath. "I never left you. I was always nearby. But my mission didn't allow me to speak. Everything I did was by choice, yes, but also by duty." Edward let out a bitter laugh. "Duty? Abandoning your own family is duty now?" "No, Dad," I replied, trying to maintain control. "But fulfilling oaths is, and I swore confidentiality. I signed protocols. My life and that of hundreds of soldiers depended on my silence." "You could have given some sign, some explanation," Carol countered. "You made us believe you had failed." "I didn't make you believe anything," I interrupted, my voice firmer. "You chose to believe. You created the narrative. When I disappeared from the radar, when I stopped responding for mission security, you didn't look for answers. You invented a story and spread it." Edward slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware tremble. "And what did you want me to say? Huh? That my son vanished and nobody knew if he was alive or dead? I'm a former lieutenant, Michael. I have a reputation." "No," I retorted, feeling my blood boil. "You always had pride, but you never had the courage to defend your own son. It was easier to say I fled, that I was weak, than to admit you didn't know anything. You thought that would tarnish your name?" He didn't respond. Carol tried to soften the mood. "We just wanted to understand." That's when Isabella arrived. Nobody expected her. She was impeccable, as always, with her access badge discreetly pinned to her lapel and a posture that mixed elegance and authority. She kissed my cheek and sat beside me. "Good evening," she said calmly. "I hope you're all well." I received authorization to speak about some points. Edward looked at her as if she were an intruder. "And who are you exactly?" "Isabella Michael," she replied, showing her wedding ring. "Senior analyst of the Strategic Intelligence Division, Colonel Michael's wife, and, more importantly, witness to everything he lived through in recent years." Everyone fell silent. "Michael served in operations whose details you'll never know," she continued. "And everything he endured, he did for the country, for honor, for you included. He was never weak. He was strong enough to endure in silence when his own family called him a coward." The silence was now absolute. "And now," Edward murmured, his voice choked, "you expect us to believe? Just like that, suddenly?" "I'm not asking you to believe," I replied, facing him. "I'm telling you this is the truth, and I no longer need to hide it. You'll deal with this however you want. But if you expect me to apologize for not being the son you expected, I'm sorry to disappoint you again." Rose finally spoke up. "I knew there was something wrong with this story from the beginning. I always knew you weren't a coward, Michael. But nobody listened. Nobody wanted to listen. They only talked about Alexander as if you had never existed. And he wasn't to blame either." I looked at my brother. He was a victim of the same lie. Alexander shook his head, visibly emotional. I believed it, Michael, because Dad always spoke with such certainty. I feel like an idiot. You were a boy, I said. You just wanted a hero in the family, and they gave you the most convenient story. The waiter appeared with the plates, but nobody touched anything. Edward was breathing heavily, as if fighting against his own shame. Carol was crying silently, holding the napkin with both hands. Isabella looked at me tenderly and slid her hand over mine discreetly. There's still time, Rose said, facing Edward. To repair, to recognize the son you hurt out of pride. But Michael can't do that for you. That's up to you. I stood up. I fulfilled my role, Mom, Dad. I was there when no one could see. And today, for the first time, I no longer need to hide who I am. If you want to know the real Michael, now it's up to you. I paid the bill before anyone said anything and left, because what needed to be said had been said. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one who owed explanations. They say physical pain is temporary, but humiliation that accompanies you in silence, day after day, I knew that better than anyone. It wasn't explicit torture. There were no screams or aggression. It was something more subtle, more cruel, being diminished drop by those who should protect you. After I was recruited, everything changed. I remember exactly the day I received the call. I was only 26 years old, recently graduated in electronic engineering with simple plans, continue in the Navy, grow through merit, keep my life clean, and my record even cleaner. But then Commander Williams appeared, talking about an ultra-secret task force, a unique chance to serve the country at a level few would reach. But you'll have to disappear officially. You'll be out of the Navy. No contact with family except those strictly authorized. I thought about it and accepted, out of patriotism, perhaps out of a sense of duty, or because at that point I already knew my presence had never been truly valued in that house. In the first months of absence, I tried to maintain contact. I sent neutral postcards and emails with generic information, but there was no response. Instead, the return calls became cold. Edward wouldn't answer. Carol spoke as if she were on the phone with a stranger, and gradually even that ceased. I only learned what they were saying about me when, 3 years later, I returned to the United States between 2 missions. I got a 48-hour clearance. I went to my Aunt Rose's birthday party, disguised in civilian clothes. I just wanted to see Alexander and hear familiar voices, but all I heard made me wish I had remained anonymous. Michael? Oh, he disappeared, Edward said, laughing with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Couldn't handle it. 3 months in uniform and asked to leave. Shame, a pity, a friend of his replied. But it happens. Training is for few. That's why I say this one here, and he pointed to Alexander, still 17 years old, will go far. Has fiber. Michael was always weak. My throat locked up. I was just a few meters from them, behind a wall, hearing everything. That night, I slept in the rental car. I didn't have the courage to knock on the door, not after hearing my mother agreeing in silence. She didn't defend me, not once. Gradually, I learned about other stories, how Carol told the neighbors that the older son got lost, how at parties Edward would proudly say he at least had a son who was worth something. And I sank deeper and deeper into missions, perhaps seeking in the battlefield the recognition that would never come from home. There were moments when I thought about giving up, about writing a letter, about sending a photo in full uniform with all the medals, about shouting to the world what I did, who I was. But all of that would violate my oath. And if there's something I learned in the army, it was that a word is a commitment. I remember a mission in Kandahar, Afghanistan. We had been infiltrated for almost 3 weeks, sleeping in holes dug in the ground, eating dry rations, and praying not to be detected. One of the youngest recruits, Silva, asked what I did to endure so much time away from family. I replied with the frankness that desperation allows, I imagine I don't have one. He looked at me, confused, and I smiled so I wouldn't cry. Alexander grew up hearing he was the replacement for the failure. He took on the role with pleasure, not knowing that the brother he idolized in silence was the same one everyone ridiculed at parties. And even so, I never responded, never reacted. But inside, each word weighed like a lead vest. When we occasionally met, Carol treated me like an acquaintance, Edward like a miscalculation. And I pretended it didn't hurt. Even at my wedding, only Rose was present. Isabella and I did everything discreetly at a military base in Spain. My parents weren't invited, not out of anger, but out of logic. What would they do there? Pretend smiles while thinking they were witnessing the union of a failure with a woman who surely didn't know the whole truth? Isabella knew everything, every wound, every silence, and even so, she stayed. She was the one who put together the pieces of me that came back broken from each mission. And even if the whole world recognized my medals, my resume, my decorations, nothing replaced the absence of an "I'm proud of you" coming from Edward. Nothing erased Carol's constant look of disappointment. When I heard General Martinez call me Colonel, it was as if a scream held back for years finally came out. A piece of me that was asleep woke up. I was no longer the same man who heard his own father say, "He's a shame," while hiding. The difference now? They knew. And I wasn't going to apologize for becoming bigger than they expected. They should treat me as the son who left or as the man who returned. And I also didn't know how to act. We were all relearning gradually, with stumbles, but without masks. It was Rose who brought the first breath of lightness to that environment. "Remember that time when Michael was caught jumping the school wall?" she said during lunch. "He swore it was just to get the ball and came back with 2 sandwiches and a Coke." Alexander laughed out loud. Carol put her hand to her mouth, surprised to remember the scene. Edward let out a low laugh, and I, for the first time there, burst out laughing. I really laughed. That sound broke something, as if everyone finally had permission to lower their guard. That afternoon, Carol called me to see some photo albums. I opened each page as if leafing through another life. There were photos of me as a child in school uniform, with crooked teeth and wet hair from the pool. To my surprise, the album didn't stop in 2014. There were more recent photos of me, images that Isabella had secretly sent, me at a ceremony abroad, me at a symbolic Veterans Award, me smiling with my team behind me. "I pretended I didn't know where you were," my mother said. "But deep down, I think I just didn't want to admit I had lost you." Keeping these photos was my way of saying there was still hope. For the first time in years, I held her hand. She squeezed back, like someone holding a lifetime in a gesture. With Alexander, the relationship took a different turn, one of respect and also of exchange. We sat one night on the porch, drinking a beer in silence until he said, "I joined the Navy because of you, not because of Dad." That surprised me. "I always thought you just wanted to prove something to him." "At first, yes," he replied. "But then I heard stories about the older brother who disappeared, the family shame, and even so, I thought there was something more. It was as if a part of me knew that story wasn't right, and I wanted to understand you." We remained silent for long minutes. "And now that you know?" I asked. "Now I want to be half the man you are. And I want my son to meet you someday." I smiled for the first time without pain in my chest. That family that rejected me was rebuilding me with their own pieces. 1 year passed, 1 year since Alexander's ceremony, 1 year since the truth came to light. Much changed since then. Today, I'm at home, a real home, my home, with Isabella by my side, stronger than ever, and a new routine that mixes physical training, mentoring young soldiers, and lectures at military schools. I haven't returned to the battlefield since Buenos Aires. I'm still called for operations, but now I act as a strategic advisor, partly by choice, partly by necessity. After everything, I understood that the most difficult war had already been won, that of my identity. That morning, I put on the ceremonial uniform again, medals aligned, erect posture. It was the day of my official decoration for Operation Garcia, but for me, it was more than an honor, it was proof that I no longer needed to hide who I am. Isabella helped me with the final adjustments to the uniform. She was radiant. "You look handsome, Colonel," she said, adjusting my tie. "Just today?" "Every day. But today, you're exactly where you should always be, being seen." The auditorium was packed, high-ranking officers, military families, Navy representatives from different countries. But in the back of the front row, there they were, Edward, in impeccable uniform like in the old days, Carol, with eyes already moist before the ceremony even began, Alexander, with his own newly earned uniform, and Rose, who was discreetly fanning herself with the ceremony program. General Martinez went up to the stage and began his speech. He spoke about honor, discipline, and sacrifice. And then he spoke about me. Colonel Michael served with courage in territories where few dared to step. He saved lives, led men, and faced darkness without asking for recognition. Today, finally, we pay him the tribute he always deserved. I was called to the stage. When I climbed the steps, a round of applause echoed through the hall. I saw Isabella get emotional. I saw Alexander clap like a brother who was finally proud without reservations. And I saw Carol crying, not from shame, but from pride, pure pride. Upon receiving the medal, I asked for the floor. This recognition, although individual, represents all the men and women who serve in anonymity, who are judged without defense, who sacrifice their name, time, and sometimes their very soul for a country that doesn't always see them. But above all, it represents something personal, the truth. Because truth always finds a way to come to light, sometimes too late, but when it comes, it heals. Applause followed, many. But what stayed with me most was Edward's hug at the end of the ceremony, strong, without words, but full of what we never said. It was there that I understood, some men win wars, others win silence. And I had won both. The reception after the ceremony was organized by Isabella, a simple, elegant cocktail surrounded by people who had been part of my journey, even without knowing it, mission colleagues, retired commanders, trusted friends. But what really caught my attention was seeing my house for the first time full of familiar voices that didn't cause me pain. Alexander was on the porch, talking to Rose about his plans for advancement within the Navy. Carol was proudly showing a framed photo of me on the living room shelf. And Edward remained apart, observing everything in silence with a glass of wine in his hands, as if looking for the right moment. And it came. When everyone had already eaten, talked, laughed, and dispersed a bit, he approached. I stood up, expecting another contained approach, some generic comment. But no. "Can I talk to you, son?" he asked with a grave voice, but different. There was hesitation. Edward, the man who never hesitated, now seemed to measure each word. We went to my office. He entered, looked around, and took a deep breath. I tried to write this conversation about 20 times, but no word on paper seemed fair. So, I'm going to say it like I always should have said. Michael, I'm proud of you, much more than I can express. I spent my whole life wanting you to be like me, to follow the same path with the same steps. But you not only blazed your own trail, you went beyond everything I dreamed for myself. I felt my eyes burn, but I didn't cry. I just let him continue. I knew you were strong. But I confused strength with obedience. You chose duty when no one was watching. You kept silent, even being humiliated. You protected lives, even when your own was devalued. And even so, you came back, not because you had to, but because you have a heart bigger than mine. He approached, putting his hands in his pockets, a typical gesture of his, but now disarmed, more human. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me all at once, but I wanted you to know I'll be here every day to deserve that forgiveness little by little. I hugged my father for the first time as a man, as a soldier, as a son, a long hug loaded with everything that was never said but that now finally was felt. That night, with the house emptier and the moon high outside, I realized that what we call reconciliation sometimes doesn't come in a heroic gesture. Sometimes it comes in a whisper, in a look, in a truth finally admitted. And in that house, for the first time, all the ghosts were at peace. 12 months passed since that night. Today, I look out the window of my new office, not the military one, but the civilian one. I opened a support center for veterans and families of military personnel who suffered from separations, traumas, and secrets, a space where truth no longer needs to be silenced. I didn't stop serving, I just changed the way. I receive weekly calls from officers asking me to give lectures at military colleges, community centers, and they all start with the same phrase, "You're the colonel whose own family thought had deserted, aren't you?" Yes, I am. But now I'm also the man who rebuilt the bonds, who unearthed his story and rewrote it with dignity. Isabella continues to be my foundation, my home. Recently, we started talking about adoption, not because we feel a void, but because now we have plenty of room to love someone from the beginning, as it should be. Alexander was transferred to a strategic base in the Northeast. He's respected, competent, and calls every week to tell me news. Carol and Edward frequently come to our house on Sundays. They bring dessert, sit on the couch, watch football. Sometimes Edward even helps in the garden in silence, but now a light silence. Rose is still the same, direct, practical, but full of affection. She was the one who gave us the name for the support center I created, Operation Truth. At the inauguration, with the press present and the troop of new recruits sitting in the front rows, I spoke little. My name is Michael. I was called a traitor, a coward, a deserter. But today, I'm here to say that truth, however delayed it may be, always wins. And if you're also in silence, know you're not alone. The entire auditorium stood up. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to me. It was knowing that that child who grew up trying to prove he deserved love now helped others understand they deserve it, even when no one says so. At the end of that afternoon, I went to the center's porch with a cup of hot coffee in my hands. Edward approached, sat beside me, and remained silent for a while. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You won, son." I looked at the sky. It was clear, cloudless, with golden light falling over the city. "No, Dad," I replied with a slight smile. "We won." And we toasted, not to the war won, but to the recovered truth, to the family that was reborn, and to all the second chances that life stubbornly insists on offering to those who don't give up on starting over.